It's a, I think that for those of our brothers and sisters who are a little it has to be literally true. My personal feeling, hey, welcome back. That it's more, you're kind of putting God in a box, and you need to, I think God is bigger than that and can fit into, as science and our understanding of the universe grows and grows, I think it enlightens for us more that God is even bigger than what we thought. And to sit there and say, oh, no, it had to be exactly like this, then that gets to be, you're kind of confining what God can do. And I
think that some people look at sciences and at science's proof that God doesn't exist, whereas I've kind of come full circle and look at it more, the more science, kind of like Einstein, the more
right.
that he felt like he learned, the more that he felt there had to be a creator.
Right.
So I've gotten to that point.
Yeah. I think it's also an interesting, you've got so much of what we believe, I mean, we talk about faith, right? That we have faith that this happens, but that's the whole definition of faith is believing something that you can't prove.
Right.
And so there's things that we have to kind of leap out on and step out in faith. And sometimes it makes perfect sense based on our experiences or, like you said, your logic or your journey. But other times, it's a flip of a coin every day I wake up whether I believe Jesus was the Son of God or not, because that's a statement of faith. It's not historically, we can talk about, and we're going to talk about in the not next week, because won't be here, but you guys can get together and talk about it if you want. But the weeks after that, historical Jesus. So that's the point where we are in the study. So there's things you can say historically and go through the analysis and kind of sift through and say, okay, I think this may have actually happened, and this was a later addition to the text. But the whole question of, was Jesus resurrected? Is Jesus actually the Son of God in the sense that Jesus is God? That's really a statement of faith. Yeah. It's hard to, and you just got to kind of decide whether you believe it or whether you don't believe it, because it's tough to come up with the actual proof. Right. There is no actual. People have been trying for 2,000 years to prove that, and. All right, let's see, what time is it? Oh, it's time to get started. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm glad y'all are here. And again, it's actually nice with a smaller group, so please feel free to stop and ask questions if we're going through stuff and you want further explanation. I record the lectures and post them on my YouTube channel. So after class, if you'd like the notes, the slides, and access to the lectures, give me your email address and I can include you on the list. So today we're going to talk about Caiaphas. Joseph Caiaphas, everybody know Caiaphas? He was the high priest. Last week we rocketed through 1,000 years of history and got from the ancient Israelite kings to the Roman Empire and kind of went through that, and I'll recap that. So we're going to do Caiaphas since it's Lent, and we're talking about the Easter story. No class next week. Terry and I are going to visit my daughter in Texas, so we'll be gone that week. And then we're going to do Pilate, a special on Pontius Pilate, and then the week before Easter, a special on the crucifixion, talk about the details of the crucifixion and what we can look from that and learn from that from a historical and archaeological standpoint. And then, hey, good morning, come on in. And then we'll skip class for Easter Sunday. Our family tradition is get up, go to the beach, or sunrise service at the beach. Hey, good morning. And then go home and go back to bed for a little bit and then go have brunch. So that's what we're going to do on Easter. And then the week after Easter, then we'll start a 2 or 3 week session on the historical Jesus. And we'll talk just through what do we know about Jesus? What can we say historically about Jesus? Because and what can we infer? And a lot of it is us kind of cross-referencing the various gospel stories, because there's not a lot of data out there. For someone who is so influential in human history, he didn't leave behind any writings. Nobody wrote stories or books about him except for the first 100 years after he lived. You know, there were a few stories, you know, the Christians, there was a small group of people who were starting to write, but nobody ever sat down. There wasn't anybody following them around writing, and today Jesus went here, and filming them and posting it on Instagram or any of that stuff for Jesus. So we'll have to kind of dig through the text and see what we can figure out. Okay, so let me just set the scene for you from last week, recap from last week. We've talked many times over and over again about how influential the Babylonian exile is on Judean theology, Israelite theology, the whole understanding of God. During the Babylonian exile, the Babylonians took everybody out of the land that God had promised them, or that they said God had promised them. And in the ancient world, that meant that your God had been defeated by a superior God. But for whatever reason, one of the few times in history, ancient history, the Judeans, the southern kingdom folks and the remnants of the northern kingdom, hung on to their belief that God was in fact going to maintain God's promises to them. And about 100 years, a little less than 100 years later, Cyrus the Great, who was from Persia, came up, defeated the Babylonians, and Cyrus's mindset was like, listen, you don't have to be in exile, you don't have to be slaves, go back to your homeland, follow your own worship practices, follow your own laws, just send me the money, and don't start a rebellion, and everything will be cool. So the Israelites love Cyrus, and we talked about Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. There's a whole 10 chapters in Isaiah that talks about Cyrus being the Messiah, using that same messianic language that they would use for the kings, God's anointed one. We talked about the Cyrus cylinder that was found in Mesopotamia, and the whole message that was on that was written to the Babylonians, is almost identically contained in Isaiah. So everybody loved Cyrus. And Cyrus allowed them to rebuild, and he funded the rebuilding of the temple, which was great. And that kicked off what's known as the second temple period. So from the time the temple's rebuilt in around little before 500 BCE, all the way through until 70 BCE or 70 CE, when the Romans came and destroyed it after the Jewish revolt in the first century. That whole time frame is called Second Temple Judaism. If you're reading or studying, sometimes you'll run across that term, and it's a very refined form of the temple cult. The Jewish people kind of came back and said, this time we're going to do it right. There was a big debate before the Babylonian exile and during the exile between the Israelites as to how do you worship God. And there's one group that said you worship God only at the temple. That's the only place God lives and resides. And if you're worshiping God at other shrines and other altars, or if you're worshiping other gods in this polytheistic world along with Yahweh, you're doing it wrong. And what they concluded after the Babylonian exile is that the first group was right. You had to do it at the temple. So they doubled down and tripled down on the temple, and that became the kind of the central focus of Israelite society and worship and religion. And then we go through, and the Greeks come along after a couple of 100 years of the Persians, and their mind frame was, we're going to win you over through cultural inundation. It's a culture war. It's a culture battle. So we've conquered you militarily. Send us your thing, but we're going to turn you all into Greeks. And so Greek philosophy, Greek ways of thinking, Greek worship styles, all of that became very in vogue. And the Israelites, and at first it wasn't horrible, but as time went on, it got more and more requirements. And to the point where the Seleucids, the Greek rulers of Israel at the time, came into the temple, desecrated the temple, sacrificed a pig on the altar in the holiest of holies so that they could worship for Zeus. They forbid Jewish people from going to the temple. They forbid them from getting circumcised, which was a major rite for the Israelites. So at some point there was the big rebellion against that, and for about 80 years the Israelites threw off the Greek overlords and they got to rule their country autonomously. But that didn't last long. When the guy that I can't remember his name, who they appointed, the king died, he didn't leave behind any clear heirs, which was a problem in the ancient world. And so a bunch of internal fighting broke out. And then along comes the Romans, who have been growing in power. And they're like, we can't have all of this fighting and instability on our border. And they came in and took over. So Rome took over, and it's often called, I'm sure you all have heard, the Greco-Roman Empire. And that's because even though they were from Rome in Italy, they had been overthrown, several hundred years before by the Greeks, and had gone all in and adopted Greek philosophy and Greek theology and Greek way of doing things. They were Greek speaking. They spoke Latin in Rome and in Italy, but the common language was Greek across the entire empire. Any questions? That's a super fast history. So at the time when we get to Jesus, we have the situation in Israel where the Galilee, this is the Galilee here in pink, it's being ruled by a client king of Rome called Herod Archelaus Antipas. Herod Antipas. I may be getting them mixed up. Anyway, he was ruling up here. He was kind of a client king. He was one of the sons of Herod the Great. When Herod died, they divided the kingdoms up. And then the southern part had been ruled by the other son, the other brother, and he was a disaster. Not well liked among the people, not well liked among the Romans. And after about less than 10 years into his rule, the Romans came in, overthrew him. So the Romans here were in charge. It was a direct Roman control. So they had a prefect, a military leader who was kind of in charge of the whole area. The Bible calls, that eventually became Pontius Pilate, was put into that role. So everybody knows Pontius Pilate. And in the biblical story, they talk about he's the governor. And that's kind of the closest English translation to how they had the structure. But he was more of actually like a military leader than a civilian elected governor. So Jerusalem down here is all under direct control of the Romans. And so if you remember, when we got to the Passion Week narrative, there's a lot of consistency. We've been reading so many stories, and there's so many inconsistencies, right? And between the historical record and everything. The Passion Week narrative is one of the most consistent, internally consistent stories, and it's pretty much documented in external sources as well. So it's one of the things that we have a level of confidence when we talk through the story. All the Gospels pretty much capture all of the same events. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. That's captured in all of the Gospels. in the ancient world, if you came riding in on a stallion, a big horse, you were getting ready, or a chariot, you were getting ready to go to battle. It was a very militaristic. But if you were coming in peace, if the king was coming into your town and he wasn't coming to overthrow you, the king would ride in on a donkey. It's kind of like an easier, I'm not here to, I don't have all my war machine with me. I'm just here to hang out for a little while and chat. So the fact that he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey has a lot of symbolism, especially for the Jewish people. Then Jesus goes, and there's the cleansing of the temple. He goes in and he overturns the money changers' tables. He throws everybody out. That's captured in all the Gospels. John puts this event not during the Passion Week, but in earlier in Jesus's ministry. So it's still there, but in John, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and we'll see this more in a few weeks, Jesus is mostly just hanging out up in the Galilee. He's not really attracting much attention, and it's not until at the end of his ministry he goes down to Jerusalem and then attracts all this attention, gets cross-threaded with the Romans, and ends up getting crucified. In John, Jesus does this earlier, and so there's this tension all through his ministry. It's always this battle kind of between, he gets on the radar of the priests and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Romans early on. And so there's always kind of this tension throughout the narrative of that happening. But they all have the story and they all kind of agree that's something that Jesus probably did. And then Judas gets the high priests come to Judas. They say, all right, we need to get rid of Jesus. Judas agrees to betray Jesus. We'll talk about Judas a little bit in a couple of weeks. And then Jesus goes and they have the Last Supper with his disciples. And then Jesus, after that Last Supper, goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he gets arrested by the soldiers. Depending on which account you read, there's naked people running around. There's people getting their ears chopped off. It's like it's a crazy scene. Then Jesus gets brought before the high priest, who's Caiaphas, and what the Bible calls the Sanhedrin, or the council of the elders. They have a trial. They find him guilty of blasphemy by claiming that he's the Son of God, but they don't have the authority in the biblical text, according to what they say. We don't have the authority to kill him, so they take him to Pilate, who is the governor or the prefect at the time, and say, hey, this guy is claiming to be the king. That's treason, insurrection, rebellion. You need to do something about it. Pilate, depending on which version, says, yep, and he puts him on the cross. Or in other versions, in other of the Gospels, there's this long debate. In the Gospel of John, Pilate basically doesn't want to do it. He tries to find every excuse to not do it, and then ends up famously washing his hands and saying, my hands are clean of his blood. It's you guys who want to kill him. Or maybe that's Matthew. I can't remember which one. But anyway, he famously washes his hands. So that has stuck around throughout history. You watch movies, and anybody who makes a difficult decision and washes their hands of the stink of the corruption or whatever, it's all referencing back to Pilate. And then, of course, Jesus gets crucified, hung on the cross, crucified. He dies, and he gets buried. So that's the Passion Week narrative. Everybody, you guys are all familiar with that, right? Nothing new there. All right, so we want to talk about Caiaphas, who's a good guy or a bad guy. Now, my only reference for Caiaphas was Jesus Christ Superstar, which is this guy, Bob Bingham here. And I think every time I hear Caiaphas, all I can hear is, this Jesus must die. Super deep bass. That's the most singing you're ever going to get out of me. So that's it. Super bad guy. And the more I thought about it, it's like really, in all of art and literature, the bad guys always have deep bass. Darth Vader, deep bass. None of them have a high soprano voice. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about this historical piece of Caiaphas. He's kind of a main character. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? The biblical text certainly plays out that he's a bad guy. He's the one who got rid of Jesus. But as with everything, there's kind of two sides to the coin, and you may say, maybe depending on where you sit, maybe he wasn't such a bad guy. So he's a historical figure. He's accounted for, but in all four of the Gospels. He's mentioned in Josephus, and and we have some archaeological evidence for him. So it's pretty good for an ancient person, pretty good evidence that he's a real person, that he was actually the high priest. He wasn't just a literary construct that the biblical authors used to kind of write the story around. He was appointed high priest around 18 of the Common Era. So this is kind of getting late. He and Jesus are maybe about the same age. You know, they're both kind of born earlier. Caiaphas might be a little older than Jesus at the time. He held office for 19 years until 36 of the Common Era, when he got removed by the Syrian governor. And that is, we're going to talk about that because that's really kind of an interesting discussion. So he ruled the temple for 19 years, which was the longest of anybody during the Roman rule time. Nobody during the Roman period ruled as the high priest for that long. So he had some staying power. He was probably pretty wise when it came to how to work the situation between the Romans and the Jews and to kind of keep everybody happy. He gets mentioned by name in Matthew and John, and he gets mentioned by the title high priest in Mark and Luke, but the same character is there the whole time. And then he also shows up briefly as a character in the book of Acts. He's the one when Peter and Paul get thrown into prison, right? And Caiaphas comes in and is like, dude, you guys, we just killed Jesus for this. You can't keep running around saying that Jesus is God. And they're like, well, that's what we're going to say. And so he puts them in prison, and then there's famously a big earthquake, and they get out of prison. And Caiaphas is like, oh. And then that's all they have about Caiaphas. So while we don't know a lot about Caiaphas, we do, other than these basic facts, we do know a lot about what the high priesthood looked like during this time frame. So after Pompey, the general, came and took over Palestine in 63, Israel got governed by a lot of client kings and governors. Herod the Great was the king that we all know, right? Because he's featured prominently in the Christmas stories. But one of the things he did when he took over, and he was Jewish, but he was very Greek in his background. He was not what we would think of as a devout Jew. He was very much in league and on board with the Roman agenda. So he had some Jewish, he was Jewish, but everything about his rule was Roman. And what he did when he came in, the high priests, if you remember, had always kind of come from the priestly line. And so it was an inherited thing to be a priest. Your father was a priest, you become a priest. The Levites are the priestly line of Israel. They didn't have any territory. They were always kind of the lineage. Herod came in and said, this is a problem, because when that happens, I can't have any guarantee of that they'll do what I tell them to. So he gets rid of that, and he starts appointing the high priest himself. And when Herod died and the Romans took over, they were like, this is a pretty good system, because what we have now is a high priest who follows our agenda and our rules and isn't running some kind of counter countercultural experiment over in the temple. And you have to remember that in this ancient time, it wasn't separation of church and state. Politics and religion were intimately and integrally woven together. Richard.
Who was it that appointed Herod the king?
The Roman governor up in Syria who got the approval for it from the Roman emperor. I can't remember his name. I can't remember which Roman governor. So if you think about it, politically, there was the emperor, right, in Rome, and then in the Roman Senate, and then they called it the legate of Syria. So Syria, Lebanon, Israel, that whole kind of what we consider now the Middle East was all under the rule of a governor in Syria. And that governor was more political, assigned by the Roman Senate and could reach back to the Roman Senate in the era. That was more of a political appointment. And then down in the provinces, they had military leaders who, you know, they came out of the military, they had control of all the troops and all the, so it's kind of a mishmash. Anything else? You look like you're going to ask a question.
It just makes perfect sense.
Okay. So Herod was like, all right, I got to start appointing high priests. And so that carried on. And there were many. Josephus goes through the whole line of priests when he writes. So Josephus is writing at about 60 or 70, after that, 70 or 80 or 90. And he was a general, a Roman or a Jewish general during the Revolution. He got captured by the Romans, and right when they were about to execute him, he was like, hold on, I can tell you all about the history. I'm a good writer. I can write stories and histories for you, and I can work with you guys. And so they said, okay, fine. So the Jews all considered him to be a traitor, but the Christians loved Josephus because he mentions Jesus a couple of times and Jesus' disciples. But the other thing that Josephus did is he just kind of gave this whole long history of the Jewish people. So we have a pretty good historical record of what all went on. And there were many, many high priests who came in, they were in office for a year, they did something to tick off the king or the Roman governor, and then they were out and they brought somebody else on.
Okay, so if Caiaphas was appointed high priest by the Romans, how did
Correct.
the Jewish people in the street really, I mean, how comfortable with this?
What?
Because the Romans have just tossed out all of their knowledge that all priests came from the line of Levi.
Yep. That's a great.
Not that they had a choice, but.
That's a great question. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. And I think it's an open subject. I think in many cases they were not very happy, which may be why they were changing priests out every year. They were either not towing the political line or they didn't have control over the Jewish people. Everybody was uprising and rebelling all the time, and the priests couldn't control any of it and settle it down. And so they would replace them. The one main job, the key job that the high priest had was to oversee the temple cult, right? So we're in Second Temple Judaism. And the Jews only had one temple. The Romans, you could go into any Roman city and there'd be a temple to Dionysus or a temple to Zeus or a temple to whoever. And so it wasn't quite as big. You know, they had priests who attended at those temples, the Greek temples, but they didn't quite wield the power that the Jewish leader had, because in Jewish theology at this time, it all came down to the temple. And the high priest becomes the mediator between God and the people. And so one of the things that he did is when he would go into, and so one of his key things was to, on the Day of Atonement, he would go into the temple, into the inner chamber or the Holy of Holies. I've got a picture in the next slide. And he would ask God for forgiveness for the sins of the nation. He was the only one who was allowed to be there. And when he went in, he was in the presence of God, they believed. And sometimes he might get a prophetic message from God, or he might get told something by God. It makes you wonder what actually happened if he's the only one who ever went in there. It's like, well, okay, whatever he says when he comes out is what happened. So just real quick, if you want to think about the Jewish temple, this is kind of a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. There was this outer court when you came into the temple. And just for reference, it's about 2 football fields wide and about 4 football fields long. So it's a pretty big complex. This outer court was called the women's court, and you could come in and everybody was welcome there. And then on the inner court became where only the Jewish men could come. And then when you went inside the temple, this was only for the priests, and they could come in and do a bunch of stuff in here. But then back in the back is the Holy of Holies. And that's the only place where only the high priest could go one time a year. Now, I don't know if this is true, but this is, well, I got told a lot of things when I was growing up that turned out to not be true about religion. I got told that men had one less rib because than women because Adam, God had taken the rib out of Adam. And then I tell my wife, who's, taken anatomy, and she's like, where did you get that idea? That's not true. So I don't know if this is true, but this is what I was told, is when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, nobody else could go in there. But you're going into the presence of God, and if you died, nobody could get you out. Or they'd have to wait a year to go get you out, so they would tie a rope around his waist so that when he went in, if he died while he was in there in the presence of God, they could haul him back out. It's a great story. I have no idea if it's true or not, but I thought it was an interesting story. Okay, so Caiaphas, it appears from the Josephus records, came from a priestly line. So he was kind of a Levite. So he was in a what was considered by the Jews to be a priestly line. But what really did it for Caiaphas is he married really, really well. So he married the daughter of Annas, who was the high priest. He was the high priest for about 7 years. He was very well connected with the Romans. So it seems likely that Caiaphas was also very connected with them. And he was from all that we can see, is a Sadducee. And we're going to talk about the different sects, but the Sadducees were the ones who really ran the temple, and they kind of were the elite, the aristocrats of Jewish society. They were very into Roman circles. Caiaphas gets named the high priest. So Annas gets booted out as high priest, but he doesn't get killed. When I say he gets booted out, he gets taken out of office. And then he has like 3 or 4 sons, and they all come in, and they only last like a year or less each. And so finally, the Romans say, "Who do you think should do it?" And they pick Caiaphas, and he comes in, and he lasts 19 years. So a very long term. Probably very well educated, both in a Greco-Roman education and in the Jewish tradition. He knows the Jewish scriptures. So during this period of time, there were, just like today, there's a bunch of different groups and sects that are running around. And there's 4 that we really know a lot about from the Bible and from other histories. These are kind of the main 4. I'm sure there were many others, and they all don't fit as neatly into the box as I'm going to summarize it. But the first one was Pharisees. We all know Pharisees, right? Anybody who's read the gospel, because that's who Jesus is always battling and debating. They're the foil for which he can use his teaching. There are some scholars who make the argument that Jesus may have in fact been a Pharisee, that he may have been a Pharisee, trained as a Pharisee, and he was kind of trying to reform. He was kind of like, you guys this is not the right way to do things. And he was trying to reform the Pharisees. There's other scholars who say that's ridiculous. So I think it's an interesting topic. I told my mom that one time. My mom is very, very, very traditional, very, very evangelical. And she was like, that's ridiculous. Who would say that? Clearly that person has never read the Bible before. But these were the teachers, the rabbis. Everybody calls Jesus rabbi, a teacher. That, you know, they're the ones who interpreted the legal codes. They followed the Torah, but they were also writing, there were other oral traditions, they were writing other books. They would balance them all together. They really emphasized the observance of Jewish law on a daily basis. It's like, look, and this is very similar to teachings of Jesus. You can't just go to the temple once a year and make a sacrifice and then do whatever the heck you want the other 364 days, because that's not the point. The point is that you follow Jewish law. Now the Pharisees, or at least parts of them, took it to extremes, because they were like, you know, they were always accusing Jesus of, you know, this disciple, he healed somebody on the Sabbath. And they're like, oh, you violated the law, that's evil, that's wrong. And Jesus is like, how is making someone whole or doing God's work wrong on the Sabbath? You guys have it all. You can't see the forest because of the trees. The other group were the Sadducees. They were the elite and the aristocratic. They show up occasionally in the biblical stories, but their focus was temple leadership. They were the ones who were cooperating with the Roman authorities. We don't know too much about them because they didn't leave behind any writings that we have. I mean, if they wrote anything down, we don't have it anymore. So we're limited in what we know, whereas the Pharisees left tons of writings. The Talmud, the Mishnah, all these Jewish texts that you may have heard of, all came from the Pharisee line, the Pharisaic tradition. And then there were the Essenes. They were fairly short-lived because their deal was, things are not going well in the temple, you're not following God, so we're just going to go out to the desert and hang out in the caves and worship God the way God wants to be worshiped, which is great if that's what you believe, but it doesn't do much for promulgating your line, because, you know, hey, cute girl, why don't you come out and hang out with me in the desert in a cave? Not really a turn on. So, but we have a lot of writings. They stored and kept a bunch of different traditions, and they were the ones who curated basically the Dead Sea, what became, when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and also, the Dead Sea Scrolls primarily. That was the Essenes. And then there were the Zealots. And the Zealots were the ones who were kind of rebellious. It was a again, remember, politics and religion are very intertwined. So it was like, we need to get back to the days where we have our own king, the way God set it up to be. That's the whole point of the Jewish law and the covenant that God has with us. And so we need to take matters into our own hands, and we need to overthrow the Romans or overthrow the Greeks or whoever, and take over this mindset. So that's just a kind of a quick tradition. I think I covered most of this. Josephus described himself as a Pharisee. He said, I'm from the Pharisaic line. And he had nothing good to say about Sadducees. He said they're conservative, they're rude, they're arrogant, they take advantage of their standing, they don't do things for the people. Pharisees were generally not priests. Sometimes you had a Pharisee who was a priest, but overall they were. But Sadducees were always a priest. They were always the priestly group. And they kind of didn't have, they were the ones who hung on to the traditional temple cult, because they're kind of at the top of the food chain, right, socially. So they don't have anything. They're kind of mediating to balance out the power of Rome, and they're in a good place. They're wealthy, they're aristocratic. They don't have a need to change society too much, because they're benefiting from the society the way it is. So they're not wanting to move things. Just again, just like we see even today, the people who are in charge are happy to keep things the way it is, and it's the people at the bottom who are suffering who are the ones talking about revolution or rehabilitation of the system, or we need to change the system and get rid of it and do something different, because they're the ones who are not suffering. I also want to talk just briefly, and we'll talk about this more in the coming weeks, about apocalyptic theology. The Horsemen of Doom. Do you guys know the ring race from any Lord of the Ring fans? Nobody? They're like the cover, the impending doom that's going to destroy everything. So during this second temple period, there was this mindset that kind of built up in Jewish thought that all of the problems that were going on, the fact that they were being controlled by other nations and other empires, the fact that they were being persecuted and things were not going well, this was, in their mind, this was because there was this cosmic battle between good and evil that was going on. And what was happening here on earth was a reflection of what was happening up in heaven, and that God was in this battle, and the angels were in a battle with evil forces. This is still a very prominent theme that continues through Christian theology for many denominations. And what was going to happen was God was going to come and set it all right. So everybody was anxiously awaiting, and this was where the Messiah started to shift from back in the Old Testament. The Messiah was just simply the king who gets anointed as the ruler. In this Second Temple period, you get this kind of movement this is where you see the movement to monotheism. From in the Old Testament, God is one of many gods, but he's the God for Israel. By the Second Temple period, you've moved to God as the only God. And you've moved from bad things happen because God is punishing you in the Old Testament to bad things are happening because God is locked into this cosmic battle. But this Messiah, a more cosmic Messiah, is going to come and defeat everyone and set the world right. And this is exactly what Paul talks about in his letters. Jesus, in Paul's mind, is the Messiah. The Messiah is going to come back, raise up the dead, set things right, create a new heaven and a new earth, right? This is all apocalyptic theology that was very popular at the time. The Sadducees generally rejected all of these beliefs. They're like, this isn't what the Bible says. This isn't what the scriptures teach. The Messiah is the king. And right now the Romans are the king, and you just need to live with it. Get over it. Get over it. And they didn't really need to do that because this whole mindset of someone's going to come and overthrow the world order, that doesn't sit well with the Romans, right? So maybe part of the reason the Sadducees weren't so keen is they were in tight with the Romans, and they're like, we can't have any of this. This is going to lead to insurrection.
They didn't believe in life after death.
They did not believe in life after death because in the Old Testament, there is no life after death. When you die, your spirit goes out of you and you go to Sheol to sleep with your forefathers. So you don't get punished, you don't get sent to heaven, you don't get sent to hell. You just go and lie with your forefathers. That's why when when Saul, remember the story, and Saul goes and gets the witch to conjure Samuel up so he can ask him some questions, and Samuel comes out of the grave as a ghost, and he's like, oh, why have you disturbed me? I was asleep, and you want to ask me a bunch of stupid questions? What's wrong with you? That whole story fits in with how the ancients viewed what happens after you die. During the Second Temple period, this idea grows of a life after death and the resurrection of the dead. That was in the ether before Jesus came along, right? That didn't start with Jesus. People were talking about resurrection. They were talking about life after death. They were talking about a new heaven and a new earth. And there are many scholars who would say today that Jesus was basically an apocalyptic prophet, that was his message, was exactly the same. This is what's going to happen. And there are verses in the Bible that clearly support that mindset. And then there are other verses, things that Jesus said, that run completely counter to that theology. So when we talk about the historical Jesus, we'll talk a little bit about why Jesus seems to say contradictory things.
How about the estimates?
It's hard to say what they thought. I think they were a little more traditional in their thoughts. I don't know.
Zealots really were.
The Zealots were hardcore into this. This was their thing, is like, hey, we're going to help God move along here. You know, we need to take some action and get God moving to bring about this
And the battle was
coming.
really about good and evil and probably the seeds of monotheism.
I think by this point, monotheism had already been, it wasn't completely there, but in Jewish thought, it was getting pretty solidified. The Jews, by the time of Jesus, were pretty solid that there's only one God, which is why they had, which is why Christianity didn't sit well, because the Christians kept saying Jesus is the Son of God. And the Jews were like, no, there's one God, and that's Yahweh. So Jesus is a great prophet, he's a great rabbi. We like Jesus, but he's not God. And that's also why Christianity and Judaism had kind of a special exemption from the Romans. The Romans were very much, you had to worship the emperor, and all the Roman gods. That, the emperor was one of the pantheon of Roman gods, and everybody they conquered had to worship them. They could worship their own gods too. I don't really care if you worship your local god. If you're living in the province of Florida and you have your own god that you worship in Florida, that's fine, as long as you worship the Roman gods and the emperor as well. But the Jews had this kind of special exemption because they had this ancient religion where they could only worship one God. And so the Romans kind of cut a deal out for them and said, listen, we get it that you're not participating in Roman society and you have these weird traditions. As long as you pay your taxes and you don't start a revolution, we won't hold you to account for that.
And what did they think about Isaiah then talking about that there was going to be a Messiah coming?
I think the traditionalists read Isaiah in the term that it was written in. That when Isaiah talks about the Messiah, it's an ancient text that's being talking about things that were happening in the ancient times. I don't think it was the Christians, I think, who really were the ones who went back through and started updating and reinterpreting all of these other visions. Some Jews may have too, because they were starting to talk about a coming Messiah as well. Okay, just real quick. One of the things that may have been in the forefront of Caiaphas's mind is when Herod the Great died, there was this triggering of a period of instability. And this is right when Caiaphas would have been kind of a young guy coming up into the priesthood or in Roman, Greco-Roman society in Jerusalem. And during the Passover feast around 3 or 4 BCE, around the time when Jesus was born, there were a bunch of crowds. Everybody was coming into Jerusalem for Passover. There was a bunch of militants saying, hey, what's happening? Maybe this is our chance. Herod's gone. Maybe this is our chance to start a war. And the Romans came in and to stabilize the situation, and they stabilized it by killing up to 3,000 people. They burned down portions of the temple in the ensuing battle. I don't think they purposely burned them down, but I think they burned them down because they were using some of the porticos as defensive positions. And kind of like really cracked down and ended this rebellion. And for a young guy like Caiaphas, who's kind of on his way up, it makes sense that would make an indelible scenario in his mindset. Rome is in control. You know, you're kind of become kind of pragmatic if you're going to be a ruler. Rome is in control. There's nothing we can do about it. They have all the military might. If we try to do something, they're just going to come in and destroy us. Better to just play along and preserve our traditions and preserve our nation than to try to upset the apple cart at this point in time. And all of this is captured extremely well in Caiaphas' quote in John. It's better to have one man die than to have the whole nation destroyed. This is where the high priests are talking about Jesus and what do we do, and he's going to create a, you know, everybody's following him and he's going to destabilize everything. And this kind of sums up that pragmatic mindset, which if you're a Jew and you're not super on the extremes of the religious circle and you just want to live a peaceful life, it's like, yeah, I don't need the Romans down here burning my farm or destroying our cities. Why do we need to do that? Why do we need to do that? So this is where good guy, bad guy comes from. In the Jesus story, Caiaphas is clearly a bad guy. If you looked at it from kind of a regular Jewish person's point of view, Caiaphas is trying to kind of maintain the status quo and not bring the Romans in to destroy their way of life. Jesus gets brought in the story after he gets arrested. He gets brought to Caiaphas and they convene the Sanhedrin. Have you guys heard that term before when you read the story? Newer translations call it the council of priests, the council. So they come into Caiaphas' palace and he's in his courtyard and they bring the council together. But the word Sanhedrin is a Greek word that just means, or Hebrew word, that means council. So it's the same thing. And they all come to Caiaphas' house in the middle of the night. They convene the council and they say, they put Jesus on trial, and people have used that as, you know, see, look, this was a kangaroo court. They tried him in the middle of the night. You're not supposed to conduct business in the middle of the night. You know, you do it in the daytime. But there's not a lot of evidence. We have some visitors looking through the windows. There was not any real evidence for this, that there was some fixed council that kind of governed. This was all comes out of later rabbinic writings in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of how they think the council should be, or how things should be run. So what seems more likely is, the high priest would kind of have his inner circle, people that he would get advice from, and he could call them up, and depending on the situation, so kind of like a president with his very cabinet departments. And if you've got a military problem, you don't call the Department of Labor in, you call in Department of Defense, and you call in the National Security Agency. But if you got a problem with price of corn, you bring in the Department of Agriculture. So depending on the issue, they bring in the right people. What was likely is they just bring Jesus, if assuming for the moment the historicity of that, they bring him in to the high priest and say, all right, we got him. What do we do with him? And I'm sure that Caiaphas would have some questions. A few of the council members, key leaders, elders would have some questions. And they come up with this idea that, okay, Jesus is guilty of blasphemy, right? Because they're saying, are you saying you're the king of the Jews? Are you saying that you're the Son of God? And Jesus doesn't really answer, and they take his silence as assent. And so, or Jesus says, you say that I am, so he doesn't really argue about it too much. And so they say, okay, this is a problem. If this actually happened, the description of a show trial seems like it's kind of accurate. They already probably were like, if you're Caiaphas and the high priest, you would already be, this is a problem. It's the Passover, everybody's coming into town, and here's this guy turning over tables in the synagogue and in the temple. What else is he going to do if we don't act? What's he going to do on the day of Passover? That could be really bad. We need to stop this in its tracks. That kind of makes sense if you're a Sadducee, because everything he seems to be doing as he comes into Jerusalem, from the way he enters, the crowds, he's not doing anything to pacify the authorities. He's kind of poking them in the eye, and at the most inopportune time, because the Romans are all here today too, right? It's the Passover. The Romans most of the time just hung out in Caesarea over on the coast, because they didn't want to have to deal with all the Jewish politics and ridiculousness. So they came, but during these high feast times when everybody was coming in, Pilate would come in and the governor, and to make sure they would double up or triple up the military presence to make sure there wasn't going to be a problem. So at the time, I think Jesus would have seemed to be to them just like any of the other zealots that we talked about. Here's a guy who's wanting to overthrow Rome, overthrow the temple cult, overthrow the way we do business, and do something different. And it's documented. There were a variety of different prophets. If you go and read through Josephus, not only Jesus, there was a bunch of different prophets who showed up during this time frame. It was kind of between the time when Rome really kind of took the grip of the Palestine up until the Roman rebellion in 67, and they had the big battle of Masada, and the whole revolution. So this was all this was kind of in the ether and in the air for about 100 years. Tensions were continuing to rise, and the Jewish insurrection mindset and this apocalyptic theology of we just need to cast these guys off because God's going to be, we'll lead the charge for God to kind of clean up the earth. So it makes kind of perfect sense why they would want to get rid of them. So we kind of talked about this. Would Jesus incite the crowds and revolt against the temple? Would he incite a revolution against the Romans? Plus, he had a bunch of Galileans. These were all these crazy guys from out in the farmlands, and he's like, these people are already crazy. Why, and they're all down here. They don't want to do it. So the best thing is just get rid of them. Like Caiaphas says in the Bible, better to get rid of one guy than to lose the entire nation. It's just a Galilean peasant. What's the big deal? What are we worried about here? This is nobody. So, why does Jesus get handed over to the Romans? In this biblical story, Caiaphas decides he wants to kill him, but according to the Gospel of John, he says they take him to Pilate, and Pilate's like, you guys just deal with them. And Caiaphas's response is, we don't have the authority to execute anyone. Scholars today find that highly unlikely, that the way the governments were set up, if you found some person who was a problem, the Romans, why crucify somebody? You just lop their head off or whatever, you run them through with the sword. They were not too shy about just getting rid of people that they viewed as troublemakers or problematic. The cases would be where if someone was a Roman citizen or if they were getting charged with political crimes. And if you're getting charged with political crimes like treason, the Romans may have maybe held that as a special case. We want to make, not that you couldn't kill them, Jews, but we want to make a spectacle of this. We want to send a message to everybody else. So if this happened, it may be that they viewed Jesus as a problem? It could be that the Romans were already worried and putting pressure, and the Jews got to Jesus first, and they just handed him over and said, here's your guy. We caught him for you. Hey, Pilate, I'm Caiaphas. Hey, Pilate, I caught him. Here you go. Here's the guy you've been looking for. Do with him what you wish. And remember that we are all on the same team here. Kind of building up favors, political favors, to be able to cash in at a later date. Caiaphas had to be that kind of leader to stay in power for nearly 20 years in the world that he was living in. He had to be a pretty good politician. The stories, why did I put this in here? Oh, the other scenario is that scholars have said is this might have been that maybe the Romans are just the ones who killed Jesus. But this story was put into the gospel stories as a way to kind of shift the blame from the Romans back to the Jews. So if you think about, Jesus was born and died here from just before 0 to around 30 of the Common Era, right? And then Paul, in his missionary efforts, started around 50 to 60 of the Common Era. That's when most scholars date Paul's letters. And then the big rebellion occurred and the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70. And the first gospel was Mark, that was written about the time, maybe debates about scholars, it might have been just before or maybe just after the destruction of the temple. But as you move forward in time, you get more and more distancing. And so whereas back in Paul's day, Christianity, the Jesus movement wasn't actually Christianity at the time, but the Jesus movement was a sect within Judaism. They all kind of considered themselves Jewish. But as time goes on and Paul's preaching to all the pagans and all the Gentiles, more and more Gentiles start coming into this religion because it's like, hey, you can come worship this God and you don't have to get circumcised and you don't have to watch what you eat. You can kind of keep living your own Greek life without having to do anything majorly different. That kind of, the Jewish people were kind of like, I don't get it. And around this time, and especially in an area around the time of the destruction of the temple, you could see things starting to really separate. The Christians are like, hey, we're not Jews. Don't round us up in this Jewish revolt, because that's not us. We're fine with Rome. We're just doing our thing, worshiping Jesus. The Jews are like, we don't want anything to do with the Christians because they're kind of weird and they believe that there's like multiple gods and we can't deal with that. So you start seeing this fragmentation and separation of Christianity from Judaism. And so what these stories of Caiaphas and the trial of the high priest, if they're not historical, then they may have been added to kind of create a thing that, hey, it's not really Rome's fault. And by the time you get to John, which was the last gospel written, that's the one where Pilate's like, there's nothing wrong with this guy. I've talked to him. Let me let Barabbas go. Why don't I let him go and we'll execute Barabbas, who was a proven insurrectionist. And the people are like, no, we want Barabbas to be released, And so you really get Pilate not wanting to be involved. So the story is, the Jews really forced the Romans' hands. It wasn't really the Romans who wanted to kill Jesus. They forced them to do it because they're not good people and we don't like them anymore because we're Christians and they're kicking us out of the temples and they're not associating with us anymore. So it could be that too. Hard to tell.
I think that the rabbis, they saw him as a threat to their power.
I think it was more honestly the Sadducees. I think the rabbis were, the Pharisees were kind of split on Jesus. There were some who didn't agree with his interpretation, but that whole rabbinic tradition of arguing, the idea is you take one biblical text and bring 3 rabbis in and you'll get 17 different interpretations, right? So there's this rabbinic tradition of arguing and debating, and it's not like we're against you so much. I don't know. They may have been a part of it. I'm sure there was a diversity of beliefs, and not everybody moves in monolithic blocks, right? But I think there was a lot of things that Jesus did that were very rabbinic in his way of teaching, the way he taught, the way he told parables, stories, that was very rabbinic. So he may have had, but he was clearly a threat to the Sadducees and the temple cult. That was definitely a threat. So depend on how you look at it. The story actually kind of makes sense in context, that if the Jews captured Jesus, they might roll him over they certainly had a reason to want him to be gone, along with the Romans. So depends on, like I said earlier, depends on how I feel in the morning sometimes as to how I view these things. It's great for a conversation. I don't know, I'm missing a thing. Okay, so I missed one point. So the other reason that people point to why Jesus may have just been grabbed up by the Romans is that when they crucified Jesus, they put a sign up on the cross that says, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," mockingly. That's a clear sign that your crime is insurrection, treason. You went against the Roman authority here. You're the King of the Jews. Well, here's what the King of the Jews gets, is you get crucified. So clearly the Romans viewed it as very political. So this whole thing about Pilate not wanting to do anything with them, I don't buy that part of it. If the Romans got Jesus, they probably would have been more than happy to off him for the Jews. So just trying to wrap up quickly. So Caiaphas continues to be the high priest for a few years after Jesus' death. And in 36 of the Common Era, Pontius Pilate gets removed. So there's a group of Samaritans up in Samaria, and remember that's under Pilate's control as well as Judea. And they were kind of out doing some worshiping stuff, and Pilate viewed it as a threat, and he sent in a bunch of Roman troops, and they killed them all, and the Samaritans appealed up to the Syrian governor, the political appointee, who said, "Man, this guy, didn't even do anything, and he came and he massacred them all. He's just heavy-handed. And so Vitellius, who was the Syrian legate, came down, and he's like, "Pilate, you're out," and he sends him back to Rome to go answer to the emperor Tiberius. But by the time Pilate makes it to Rome, Tiberius has died, and Caligula is now the new emperor, and we never hear of Pilate again. So nobody knows if Pilate gets killed or if Caligula just was like, I don't really care, but he didn't show up back in Judea again. And then after he gets rid of Pilate, Vitellius comes down to Jerusalem, and he meets with the high priest and the people, and he makes some concessions. He lowers some of the tax rates, he does some economic things, and then he gets rid of Caiaphas. He kicks Caiaphas out, and we don't hear of Caiaphas again. Some scholars point to this as evidence that the Jewish people didn't like Caiaphas. It was one of the concessions is get rid of this guy because we don't like him. But the other mindset is that maybe Caiaphas was, especially in this interim period, because things didn't happen fast in the old days. Like Pontius Pilate would be gone, and it might take 2 or 3 months before Vitellius gets down to Jerusalem. And so maybe in this period, there's a little bit of a vacuum, and maybe Caiaphas starts getting too big for his britches. He starts trying to take too much control as the interim person. And maybe it was because the people liked him and the people supported him, which is why the Romans said, all right, he needs to go. He's gathering too much popular support. We don't need another Messiah to show up here that we have to deal with. Regardless of whatever way he was, we never hear of Caiaphas again. There's a lot of stories about Caiaphas. He shows up later in rabbinic tradition. He shows up in Dante's Inferno. He's like in the 8th circle of hell, which is not a great place to be, I guess, according to Dante. But we have, basically a lot of writings about this guy and a pretty good understanding of how he may have acted. And for an ancient person, there's, I think, pretty reasonable proof of historicity. But then in 1990, there was a group of construction workers who were repaving a road in a neighborhood in Jerusalem. And they come across this ornate limestone box, which is an ossuary. So the ancient tradition was they would take you to a tomb and they would lay you out in the tomb in a cave and put the rock around it, just like we see about Jesus, and let all the body, get rid of all the flesh, right? Everything gets decayed and eaten by the rats and whatever, until after about a year, there's nothing left for bones but bones, and then they go into the tomb, collect the bones, and they put it in these nice little fancy boxes. And it's kind of like cremation, sort of, and you can save them. So they found this ossuary and they pull it out, and the inscription on the ossuary says, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Although it's a little hard to read, is it son of Caiaphas or is it actually Joseph Caiaphas? Most scholars have come to the conclusion that they think this is the bones of Caiaphas himself. This is the ossuary, which is not in the British Museum, but is actually in the Israeli Museum. And this is the inscription here on the side saying that it's Caiaphas. The bones inside, they kind of took them all out and strung them out, and it's a male that's about 60 years of age. I don't know how they came up with that, but that's what they kind of said. He was about 60, which seems to fit kind of Caiaphas's time frame. So the feeling is we found actually Caiaphas, and a little end cap, which I think is really cool from that story. If you're interested in any of this, if you're not interested, then don't come back. But if you are interested, I really recommend this book, Caiaphas by Helen Bond. Helen Bond is a scholar at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and she's a New Testament scholar and Christian history, and she did a deep dive. I listened to an interview with her, and she's like, I like the bad guys. So she goes through the Bible and does these kind of deep dives on all of the characters of the bad guys in the Bible. So I would recommend that as well as any of these other books that we've been talking about. Anybody have any questions, comments?
Thank you. That's great.
Have a great week. I won't see you next week, but the week after, and we'll do the same kind of deep dive into Pontius Pilate. Thanks, everybody.
When the switch